If Hillary Clinton was president today, it's safe to say a lot of things would be different. But would former FBI Director James Comey have a job? Maybe not. The book is called What Happened, so I want to get into a few of the what happens that you go into. I mean, contrary to what some folks have said and some critics have said, you do talk about your own campaign's missteps as part of the result. But you also talk about a few other tent poles that I want to talk about. Let's start with James Comey. Very critical of him.
Yes.
I want to take you back to 1993, and a president named William Jefferson Clinton fired the FBI director, William Sessions. Ironically enough, given what we're dealing with today with the HHS secretary for the misuse of FBI planes and cars. Had you become president of the United States, might Jim Comey have been ushered out in much the same way? I mean, it was bipartisan. Louis Freeh was teed up and ready to go. Might that have happened to James Comey?
I've thought about that, Joy, and it's such a hypothetical. I would have certainly looked hard at it, and as I write in the book, much of what he did violated Department of Justice protocol. It was unprecedented. It was outside the bounds of what prosecutors do, let alone an investigator, which is what his job was. That troubled me because you don't want people acting rashly, impulsively, or in this case, as some have suggested, under pressure for political purposes. So I would have had to really think hard about that. Now, what I believe strongly, and the case I make in the book, is separate out what he did to me, which I think was wrong, unprecedented, and ultimately cost me the election because of the October 28th letter, and what he was doing on Russia. So you can be critical of what he did in the email investigation, but you can also be very critical of Trump deciding to fire him over the Russia investigation. And I think you have to keep those two competing thoughts in your head at one time.
Yeah, you talk a lot in the book about the Russian interference in the election. You were obviously during the campaign getting intelligence or getting word that, listen, there's hacking going on, there is an attack on the country from Russia that is attempting to interfere in the election. The president knew it. Presumably the Trump campaign was getting the same information. At this point, do you believe that the Trump campaign colluded to assist Russia in interfering in our election?
I don't think we can reach that conclusion. I think there are lots of facts that are being proven every day, that there was certainly communication by email, phone, in person. There was certainly an attempt by many of the Trump associates to hide the connections that they had with representatives of the Russian government and people close to Putin. We know that Putin was intent upon helping Trump. That's no longer subject to debate. We knew that he wanted to defeat me. That's also accepted. And now what we're finding out is how some of that happened. The interference with the election included everything from what we now know about Facebook ads and posting. And I was so amused when Senator Mark Warner pointed out the Facebook ads were paid for with rubles.
Yeah.
We now know about phony demonstrations with people pretending to be Americans who were agents of Russia. We now know that, without a doubt, the DNC had material stolen. John Podesta had material stolen through Russian intelligence efforts, through cyber attacks, which then migrated to WikiLeaks, which is pretty much a wholly owned subsidiary of Putin and the Kremlin, which then were strategically put out to hurt me and hurt Democrats. I mean, we just know a lot, but I'm going to leave it to the investigators in both the Congress and the special counsel to actually come up with whatever legal conclusions. Were there laws broken? What more do we need to know? But I want to make this point, Joe, because it's really important, Joy, to say this. Even if there was not all of this smoke around the Trump campaign's involvement with the Russians, we should still be really upset and determined to do something about it. Yeah. If I had been elected president, and I knew that this was out there, even if in some other alternative universe it had helped me instead of my opponent, I would have demanded we do an independent commission with all the authority needed, subpoena power, to get to the bottom of this, because it's not going to stop.
Right.
It has been too successful for Putin. And now we're hearing these bragging comments from Russian media persons, from Russian members of parliament and their government, saying, yeah, we picked a president. We won an election. That should terrify every American. I don't care what party you are, because maybe it was me today, it can be somebody else tomorrow. And we're not doing enough. In fact, Trump has this phony voter fraud commission, which is not a problem that anybody besides the most rabid Republicans want to pursue in order to suppress even more votes, particularly African Americans and young people, so that they can try to further pervert the electorate to elect, their candidates. They should be having a 5-alarm committee that is looking at everything that we can do to protect ourselves. Virginia just stopped using touchscreen computer voting because it's so vulnerable.
Right.
We need to look at all the voting machines. Every Secretary of State needs to be, assisted in making sure that they are not being hacked and attacked. So I know the Russians had a heavy thumb on the scale, and I know it affected voters because we track it in the book about what people were looking at, primarily when they dumped all the WikiLeaks stuff. And we know that they had to have gotten really good advice about how to be politically strategic in doing that.
And you write in the book that part of you wished that President Obama at the time had come out and given a big national address to warn Americans of Russian interference. Have you spoken with former President Obama about that? When's the last time you talked to him?
I talked to him a couple of weeks ago. I haven't had a chance, though, to sit down and talk with him. I've been really so focused on getting the book done. But I do. I've talked to people from the White House, and there's been a lot of conversation. Here's how I see this. First of all, when something unprecedented happens, it is hard to know what to do. And he thought I was going to win. He told me that the night before in Philadelphia. Big hug. So proud of you. You're going to do this. He and Michelle could not have been better in supporting and advising me. And I think he didn't want to look like he was in any way using the office of the presidency to partisan ends. Obviously, he was campaigning for me, but This is a national security issue.
Yeah.
I also think that he was under pressure from the other side, and I write about this. I mean, Mitch McConnell basically threatened the White House and the Democratic leadership in the Congress. If you go public with the intelligence we have been provided, we will call it partisan.
Does that make them complicit? Does that make Republicans complicit in what Russia did?
I think there's a lot of questions about it, but he in particular acted in a partisan rather than patriotic manner. Harry Reid, who, like everyone who was briefed on this intelligence, that I was not, was really upset and tried to keep forcing Comey, because my other problem with Comey is he was perfectly happy to talk about a really dumb mistake I made with emails that became an even dumber scandal, but he wasn't willing to tell anybody, oh yeah, and we're investigating Trump and the Russians. And he just would not do that. And so Harry Reid wrote him in, I think, late August, basically saying, come on, there are reports in the press, get out there and tell the American people. Now, having said all that, of course, I wish there had been some way, given the predicament the president found himself in, to alert the public. Because once I lost and all this ton of information started flooding out about everything that was happening, the Dutch were able to prevent Russian interference in their election. The French could prevent it. The Germans are working to prevent it because they all knew. Right. And they could make the case to their electorate, you may be whatever party you are, but we cannot tolerate a foreign adversary trying to pick our next leader.
You mentioned emails. It's a story that you write in the book, literally just took over coverage of you.
Yeah.
If you did a word cloud of what people knew, and you've been in public life for, a long time,
Right.
but the thing people knew was emails. What do you make of political journalists? You're tough on the media in this book and the coverage of your email server. What do you say to reporters who say, well, the email scandal was not the media's fault, it was your fault?
Oh, well, I made the original mistake. But, people running for office make all kinds of mistakes. I mean, Trump had a million mistakes that he made before he ever ran and that he made once he declared to run. That didn't matter. There was a little bit of coverage on whatever it might be, and then it faded away. The emails was a constant diet. Now, I've talked to members of the press because, look, I am a huge proponent of the First Amendment, and we need a really smart, savvy press. And here's what members of the press have basically said to me. First of all, yeah, it was a legitimate subject to cover. We overdid it. And I couldn't agree more, especially when you compare that in 2016, there were only 32 minutes on TV, and I guess that's the 5 major networks devoted to all policies. So I don't blame voters for not knowing that I had a gangbusters college affordability and a gangbusters way to fix and better the Affordable Care Act and everything else. 32 minutes for all policies, 100 minutes on my emails. And after a while, Joy, there was nothing new to say.
Yeah.
And as I point out in the book, all of the crazy accusations were just not true. And you can read it and you can see, and it's not my voice, it's people who have credibility on these issues. So that really did bother me. It was way overhyped. And again, there was this attitude like, well, you're going to win anyway, and so we have to vet you harder. Trump is the reality TV show candidate. You're going to be the next president, which is a terrible assumption to make, because what we found in this election is that it really matters how the press covers someone who is so unusual as Trump was, with the same tough standards consistently. You don't give him 30 minutes of podium time, an empty podium. You need to be going after all the things he did to people, his scandals, his bankruptcies. Yeah, you report it, but hey, that hurt real people. There was no evidence anything I did ever had any impact. So I think there was such a disproportionate response, a lack of understanding about, be fair. If you're going to cover me like this, cover the other guy like this. Because if you look at those word clouds, email dominates mine, and terrorism and immigration dominates his. And the exit polls were interesting because for people who cared about the economy, I actually won those voters. If you cared about immigration or terrorism, he won those voters, even though I was the one in the Situation Room advising the president about going after bin Laden. So it was all out of sync in lots of ways. And the final thing I would say about this is it would not have mattered except for Jim Comey's October 28th letter. I mean, we weathered his press conference, which was so unfair and wrong. We weathered, all of the attacks coming from Trump and his people. We had a great convention. I won 3 debates. We were really riding momentum. And then, people had every reason to wonder, what does this mean? And I don't know why he did it. I think it's very telling that Rudy Giuliani knew that he was going to do it 2 days before, because there's a lot of reporting that Giuliani and current and retired members of the FBI were dead set against me. And so they were pressuring Comey to do even more. And the whole thing, I think, reflects, very badly on his judgment and his objectivity.
More of my one-on-one interview with Hillary Clinton next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.